Hi class. I'm going to go over today the fundamentals of making a symmetrical pinch pot. So what I've done is I've gotten a lump of clay. This is terracotta. It's a little bit different than what you guys use in the classroom. And I'm just compacting a small ball that's about the size of a tennis ball, maybe a little bit larger. So it's important that you compact the surface and make it as tight as possible. So really when we're making a pinch pot or the fundamentals of a pinch pot, it's really quite simple. There's a couple of things to remember. Number one, the action of pinching is basically by taking your fingers and literally pinching them together. But the force of your fingers actually have some indication of how the shape is going to actually evolve. So if I use my thumb and exert more force in the interior of the pot, the bowl itself will have a tendency to spread outwards. If I use more force with my exterior fingers on my index and my middle finger, the walls of the pot will actually go vertical. So what I want you guys to try to do is to make a piece that has even walls and even rim. It can be round or other shapes, but it must be symmetrical. And I want it to be more vertical in orientation than out. So I'm going to start with this compact ball, and I'm just going to start with my thumb and literally push it into the clay. So I spin it down on my thumb, and you don't want to go all the way through the bottom of your clay, but you want to actually feel your thumb through the bottom. And this is basically the beginning of the vessel form. So at this point, I'm going to cradle the clay in my hand and basically spin the clay in a kind of a clockwise rotation, and actually literally pinch my hand on my fingers, and you can literally see the clay moving up the wall. In a sense, this is sort of like throwing a pot on a potter's wheel. You're actually lifting the clay up the wall. Now with clay, you need to remember the properties of clay. One of the properties, of course, is plasticity, which means its ability to bend. But another component of clay that's really important to realize is that it shrinks as it dries and also as it fires. And that's a result of the water that's inherent in the clay itself. Shrinkage becomes an issue because as the clay gets dried out on the surface and you're compressing this wall, you're going to end up with cracks on the surface if you don't watch it. And one of the primary places to get cracks is actually on the rim itself. So in this rim, because it's exposed to the air and it dries the most quickly in the whole pot, I'm going to focus on this rim after I get the form roughed out in the sort of sense it is now. So I'm going to use my thumb, which has a natural sort of bend to it, and I'm literally going to pull the clay over my thumb and thin the rim out first. And this is really important because what it does is, one, it holds the diameter of the pot at the top a little bit smaller than the body of the pot. And two, it actually thins this rim out while the clay is in its most wet form before it gets a chance to start cracking. So I'm just going to go around like this and sort of thin this rim out. You can go back and forth as long as you're cradling your hand. And what you'll see is a thinner rim and a pretty thick wall. And at this point, my duty is basically to go in and thin the walls to the consistency of the rim. That's what I want to see, is sort of a consistency from the floor all the way through the rim itself. So what I'll do is I'll come back down to the bottom and I'll start my pinch, and I go in the same motion that I did when I started, which is starting at the bottom and sort of spiraling my way up to the top of the pot itself. There's many ways of pinching. Some people really like to have the action of their fingers showing on this. I have a tendency to pinch in a kind of a tight way that I smooth the clay out a lot. I find this to be fairly meditative, and this is also something that you really need to practice in order to master the technique. So at this point, I'm roughing the thinness of the walls out a little bit more. I'm trying to make them more consistent with the rim itself in terms of thickness. But I do have quite a bit of clay at the bottom of the pot, and the reason is that my fingers lack the length to actually get into the bottom. So in order to get this bottom part of the pot thinned out, what I'm going to do is put my index finger and my middle finger inside the pot and literally stretch the clay out. You have to be kind of careful with this You want to be gradual, and you have to be fairly patient and not use a lot of force, because basically you're trying to stretch this clay out without tearing through the wall, and you're trying to stretch it out in a way that maintains an even wall thickness. The other thing that happens with this particular process is there's a real awareness now of this idea of the interior space of the pot. And this becomes really important when we talk about vessels all the way throughout the semester. A lot of times people will only consider a vessel form or a piece of pottery and clay, and they sort of think of it as the outside surface. But this surface is the shape or the form of the piece itself. But what's also really important is the interior of the piece. And by stretching the clay out, this pot will always have this sort of sense of the interior of the piece or the space literally expanding outward. It's more of an illusion of that than actuality, but I think that this lends this process a lot of liveliness in the form itself. Other things that you'll notice as you're going through this, the rim is actually not going to be completely even all the way around, and that's quite fine. The reason it won't be even is because you can't actually put your finger straight in the middle of the clay when you initially start. And that initial start actually has an effect on the shape. So you can see right here on this rim, it may be difficult to see, but there's a little bit of a crack. And when the cracks start occurring, it's important to actually repair them as quickly as possible. So I'm going to take my finger and I'm just going to compress this clay down and then re-squeeze it, and that'll seal that crack up. And you want to do this while the clay is still rather wet. Now, one of the things you'll notice is I'm not using any water on this clay whatsoever, and that's an important aspect of this as well, because of the shrinkage issues. So the clay particles themselves are these flat platelets, and when you add water, they expand. And so when they start drying, the water actually causes more shrinkage, and you can have actual critical issues, especially when you're constructing complex forms. So this is how you make a symmetrical pinch pot. You can spend a great degree of time on this, refining and making it as thin as possible. I think this is a really kind of a quiet process, and this is something that's really easy to do in your own home, just sitting around, talking to friends. And you can have a number of these going at once. So this clay is still quite wet, and it's thinning out a lot more. You can sort of see it's starting to have this really nice kind of round shape. At this point, it's a little bit too wet to keep thinning. And so I can just set it aside for a few minutes on its rim, because this is a dome shape and it actually is the strongest. It won't really compress the piece itself. It gives you a chance to actually refine some of the bottom cracks if you start seeing them occur. And this is also in time where you can actually consider other things like additions, like adding a foot ring to this, which would be just roll a simple coil of clay and attach it on the bottom. So in the next video, I'm going to be talking about composite pinch pots, which are 2 or 3 or more put together. In your assignments, the composite pinch pot that you're going to have to make for this module is essentially one that's influenced by botanical forms, and you can interpret that in a really wide way. So first, perfect the symmetrical pinch pot, and once you get that down, we'll move on in the next lesson to composite pinching. Thanks a lot. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.